In April 1945, as Allied forces pushed deeper into Germany, soldiers under George S. Patton came across something they were not prepared for. It was not a battlefield. There were no trenches, no gunfire, just silence. Behind a line of trees stood a camp that had been abandoned in a hurry. Guards were gone. Gates stood open. Inside were survivors, thin, exhausted, barely able to stand. Some didn't move at all. American soldiers froze. Many had seen death in combat. This was different. Patton arrived later that day. He walked through the camp slowly, saying nothing at first. Witnesses later said his face went rigid. Not angry, not shocked, but controlled. Too controlled. Then he asked one question. "How far is the nearest town?" An officer answered, "Less than a mile." Patton nodded. What happened next shocked not only the civilians, but some of his own men. Patton ordered that local German civilians be brought to the camp. Not arrested, not accused. Brought. Some officers hesitated. These were townspeople, shopkeepers, bakers, clerks. Many would later claim they had no idea what this place was. Patton's response was cold and precise. "They will see it, every inch." By evening, trucks began arriving. Men, women, older people. They were lined up outside the gates, confused, whispering, some already protesting. Patton stepped forward and spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. "You will walk through this camp. You will look, and you will not look away." The gates opened, and the first civilian took a step inside. The civilians entered the camp slowly. At first, many walked with stiff posture, eyes forward, as if this were some kind of inspection. A few whispered that it had to be exaggerated. War rumors, enemy stories. But after only a few steps, the whispers stopped. They saw the barracks, empty, broken, stripped of warmth. They saw personal items left behind in piles, shoes, coats, bowls. They saw people who were alive, but barely. Some civilians turned their heads away. Patton noticed immediately. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't shout. He simply said, "Turn back, look again." American soldiers escorted the civilians through every section of the camp. Not roughly, not violently, but firmly. When someone tried to hurry past, they were slowed down. This was not punishment. This was exposure. One woman covered her mouth and began to cry. An older man removed his hat and stared at the ground. Another kept repeating the same sentence. "We didn't know. We didn't know." Patton stopped near the center of the camp. He looked at the group and said, "You live nearby. You smelled this place. You passed it. Remember that." No one answered. The silence was heavier than any gunfire. After the walk through the camp, Patton did not dismiss the civilians. Instead, he gave another order. They were told to return the next morning. Not to observe, not to explain themselves, to work. Local authorities were instructed to provide food, tools, and transport. Civilians were assigned tasks: cleaning barracks, repairing roofs, preparing warm meals, digging proper graves for those who had not survived. No speeches were made, no accusations shouted. But the message was unmistakable. These people were not allowed to treat the camp as something distant anymore. It was now part of their town, part of their responsibility. Some civilians protested quietly. Others said nothing at all. One American soldier later wrote that this was the moment when denial finally collapsed. Not during the tour, but during the work. When hands touched the walls. When food was placed into trembling hands. When eyes met. Patton watched briefly. Then he turned away. To his officers, he said only, "Now they'll remember." The camp would soon be handed over to higher authorities. Reports would be written, photographs taken, evidence preserved. But for those civilians, the lesson was already burned in. They had seen it, they had walked it, and now they had helped face it. The work did not end after one day. Patton ordered that the camp be documented in full detail, not for propaganda, for record. Army photographers were brought in, cameras moved slowly through the grounds, capturing barracks, fences, empty watchtowers, and the people who remained. Nothing staged. nothing dramatized. Then came another order. Local newspapers were required to print what had been found. Notices were posted in nearby towns. Civilians who had walked through the camp were instructed to speak, plainly and publicly, about what they had seen. There would be no soft language, no distancing words, not rumors, not enemy lies, just facts. Some town officials resisted. They argued it would cause panic, shame, unrest. Patton rejected the concern immediately. "Silence caused this," he said. "Truth won't." As reports spread, more civilians arrived on their own. Not ordered, not escorted. They came quietly, stood at the gates, and asked to enter. American soldiers noticed something change. People no longer asked if it was real. They asked how it happened so close to home. The camp was no longer hidden behind fences or excuses. It was now part of the public record, and the reckoning was only beginning. Days passed, and the camp did not fade from attention. Instead, it became a reference point. Civilians who had walked through it were questioned by neighbors, co-workers, even family members. At first, many struggled to speak, not because they lacked words, but because the excuses no longer worked. "I didn't know" stopped being enough. American officers noticed a pattern. The more details people were forced to confront, dates, locations, transport routes, supply lists, the harder it became to claim ignorance. This was no longer an abstract crime. It had schedules, paperwork, footprints. Patton made no public statements during this time. He didn't need to. The process was doing the work for him. Some civilians asked if they could help again. Others brought food without being told. A few returned simply to stand in silence, as if leaving felt wrong. One officer later said that the camp had become something else entirely, not just a place of suffering, but a place where denial finally failed. The war was nearing its end, but the reckoning Patton had set in motion was not about victory. It was about memory, and memory, once anchored in fact, could not be erased. As Allied control expanded, responsibility for the camp began to shift. Medical teams arrived. Administrators followed. Paperwork grew thicker by the day. But Patton made one thing clear before moving on. This place would not be quietly absorbed into bureaucracy. He ordered that local civilians continue to be involved. Not daily, not endlessly, but long enough to ensure the truth did not fade once soldiers left. Supplies were tracked publicly. Deliveries were logged. Names were written down. Witnesses remained witnesses. An American chaplain later recalled that Patton refused to allow the camp to be described as an incident or a mistake. "Those words make things disappear," he said. Instead, it was labeled exactly what it was: documented, cataloged, and preserved. Some civilians asked when it would finally be over, when the camp would be closed, when life could return to normal. Patton's answer was short: normal doesn't come back the same. When his units eventually moved forward, soldiers noticed something unusual. No one celebrated the camp's closure. No one cheered. The gates were shut quietly, not to hide what had happened, but because it no longer needed hiding. The truth had already escaped. Weeks later, American units had moved on. The camp no longer echoed with commands or engines. The ground was quieter now, but not empty. What remained was heavier than troops. Local civilians passed the site differently than before. Some slowed their steps. Some crossed the road. Others stopped, even when there was no reason to. Conversations in town changed. Certain jokes vanished. Certain phrases were never used again. People spoke more carefully, not because they were watched, but because they remembered. Teachers adjusted their lessons. Clergy changed their sermons. Town officials avoided the word ignorance. It no longer protected anyone. An American officer returning months later noted something subtle. There were no memorials yet, no plaques, no speeches, but there was silence, and it wasn't empty. It was the kind of silence that meant people had learned something they could not unlearn. Patton never returned to the camp. He didn't need to. What he wanted was not obedience, it was permanence, and permanence had taken root, not in stone or paper, but in memory. As time passed, something unexpected happened. The civilians who had once been escorted into the camp began telling others without being asked. Not in speeches, not in public squares, but quietly. At kitchen tables, in workshops, on long walks home. They described details no rumor could invent. The layout, the smells, the silence, the way survivors looked at the ground instead of at people. Listeners stopped interrupting. Questions became shorter. Voices dropped. American authorities noticed reports spreading faster than orders ever could. Patton's intent had reached beyond the camp itself. The truth no longer depended on soldiers, documents, or signs. It moved person to person, harder to deny, impossible to fully control. One civilian later admitted that seeing the camp was shocking, but having to explain it to someone else was harder, because once spoken aloud, the truth demanded responsibility. The camp was no longer just a place on a map. It had become a warning passed forward by people who once claimed they knew nothing, and that warning was still moving. Years later, people would argue about motives. Some said it was discipline. Others called it justice. A few dismissed it as theater. But those who were there remembered something simpler. George S. Patton did not ask civilians to confess. He did not ask them to apologize. He did not ask them to explain. He made them see the place, see the consequences, see what silence allows. There were no speeches carved in stone, no slogans repeated, just a moment in time when denial ended, not because it was defeated in court, but because it collapsed under reality. Long after the war, some civilians would say the same thing. That day changed how we understood responsibility. Not guilt passed down forever, not blame without end, but the understanding that looking away is a choice. Patton left no written philosophy about it, no doctrine, only an action. And that action carried a message strong enough to survive long after the fences came down. Some truths don't need to be shouted, they only need to be seen.